Hello everyone. My name is Trachea from BSE3, and for today's topic, we discuss the respiratory organs and their functions. So the respiratory system, which we call the oxygen delivery system. So the respiratory system is the set of organs that allows a person to breathe and exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide throughout our body. So the integrated system of organs involved in the intake and exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the body and the environment, and including the nasal passages, the larynx, trachea, bronchial tubes, and our lungs. So the respiratory performs two major tasks. The first one is to exchanging air between the body and the outside environment, known as the external respiration. The second one is the bringing oxygen to the cells and removing carbon dioxide from them, and referred to as internal respiration. So we have here the diagram of respiratory system and the organs. We have here the nose, mouth, trachea, bronchial tubes, lungs, and our diaphragm. So what is the functions of respiratory system? So the functions of respiratory systems: first, it supplies the body with oxygen and disposes of carbon dioxide. Second, it filters inspired air. The third one, it produces sound and contain receptors for smell. It rids the body of some water and heat. And the last one, it helps regulate the blood pH. We have here the breathing. So the breathing, or the pulmonary ventilation, consists of two cyclic phases. So the first one is the inhalation. It is also called the inspiration. It draws gases into our lungs. So next is the exhalation. It is also called the expiration. It forces the gases out of our lungs. So when we say inhale, it draws the gases into our lungs, and in exhale, it forces gases out of our lungs. Next, we have here the external respiration. The air of the outside environment enters the nose or mouth during inspiration, or our inhalation. Also, it is composed of the nose and nasal cavity, and also the paranasal sinuses, pharynx or throat, and our larynx. So all part of the conducting portion of the respiratory system. So we have here the diagram of the external respiration. We have here the nasal cavity, nostril, mouth, throat or pharynx, and our voice box or our larynx. So we have here the nose. Nose is also called the external nares. So it divided into two halves of the nasal septum. So it contains the paranasal sinuses, where air is warm. So also the nose contains cilia, which is responsible for filtering out foreign bodies. So we have here the diagram of the nose and nasal cavities. We have here the frontal sinus, nasal concha, sphenoid sinus, internal nares, nasopharynx, middle nasal concha, inferior nasal concha, and external nares. So when we say internal nares, it is the opening to exterior. And we have here the external nares. When we say external nares, it is opening to pharynx. Next is the nasal conchae. It is folds in the mucous membrane that increase air turbulence and ensures that most air contacts the mucous membranes. So it provides an airway for respiration. First, it moistens and warms entering air. It filters and cleans inspired air. The last one is the resonating chamber for speech, or it detects odors in the air stream. So pharynx. Pharynx is a common space used by the both respiratory and digestive system. And also, it is commonly called our throat. So it originates posterior to the nasal and oral cavities and extend inferiorly near the level of the bifurcation of the larynx and esophagus. So it is common pathway for both air and our food that we intake. So the walls are lined by a mucosa and contain skeletal muscle that are primarily used for swallowing. So in order to flexible lateral walls are distensible in order to for swallowing into the food to esophagus. So we have here the three sections of the pharynx. We have here the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. So when we say nasopharynx, it is contained by pharyngeal tonsils or the adenoids, which aid in the body's immune defense. So next is the oropharynx. When we say oropharynx, it is the back portion of the mouth that contains the palatine tonsils. It is aid in the body's immune defense. Next is the laryngopharynx. When we say laryngopharynx, it is the bottom section of the pharynx where the respiratory tract divides into the esophagus and the larynx. So we have here the diagram of the three section of pharynx. So in upper right, we have here the nasopharynx, the middle, the oropharynx, and the last one is the laryngopharynx. So next is the larynx. So when we say larynx, it is the voice box. It is a short, somewhat cylindrical air vents in the trachea. So it prevents swallowed materials from entering the lower respiratory tract. Also, it conducts air into the lower respiratory tract. So the larynx also produces a sound. Also, it's supported by a framework of 9 pieces of cartilage, that 3 individual pieces and 3 cartilage pairs. So it is held in place by ligaments and muscles. Trachea. So it is a flexible tube and also called windpipe. So trachea, it is extends through the mediastinum and lies anterior to the esophagus and inferior to the larynx. So also the trachea is a cartilage rings that reinforce and provide rigidity to the tracheal wall, and it is ensured that the trachea remains open at all times. That was a trachea. So the trachea at the level of the sternal angle, the trachea bifurcates into 2 smaller tubes, and the tubes that call the right and left primary bronchi. So each primary bronchus project laterally towards each lungs. So the lungs, we have here the lungs. Each lungs has a conical shape. It's wide concave base raised and upon the muscular diaphragm. It is a superior region called the apex. It projects superiorly to a point that is slightly superior and posterior to the clavicle. It is both lungs are bordered by the thoracic wall anteriorly, laterally, and posteriorly, and it is supported by the rib cage. So, toward the midline, the lungs are separated from each other by the mediastinum. And the relatively broad, rounded surface in contact with the thoracic wall is called the costal surface of the lungs. So, we have here the lungs. The diagram of lungs that we have here, the windpipe or the trachea, the lungs, and the bronchus. So, in left lung, it divides into 2 lobes by oblique fissure, and it is smaller than the right lung. And left lung is the cardiac notch, or the accommodates with the heart. So, the right lung, it is divided into 3 lobes by oblique and horizontal fissure, and it is located more superiorly into the body due to the liver on right side. Next, organs of the respiratory system is the pleura. So the pleura is the outer surface of each lung, and the adjacent internal thoracic wall are lined by a serous membrane called pleura. So the outer surface of each lung is tightly covered by the visceral pleura. So while the internal thoracic walls, the lateral surface of the mediastinum, and the superior surface of the diaphragm are lined by the parietal pleura. So the parietal and visceral pleura layers are continuous at the hilus of each lungs. So the pleural cavities, the potential space between the serous membrane layer is a pleural cavity. So the pleural membranes produces a thin, serous pleural fluid that circulates in the pleural cavity and acts as a lubricant, ensuring minimal friction during our breathing. Next, we have here the pleural effusion, pleuritis with too much fluid. And we have here the diagram, which is the trachea or the windpipe goes into the left lobes and right lobes through the right bronchi, which is secondary bronchi and left bronchi through bronchioles. And the last one is the pleura through diaphragm. So, how does lungs work? So, lungs works, air enters your lungs through a system of pipes called the bronchi. So, the alveoli are where the important work of gas, its exchange take place between the air and your blood. So, it covering each alveolus, and it is a whole network of little blood vessels and called capillaries. So, it is important that the air in the alveoli in the blood and also the capillaries are very close together so that the oxygen and carbon dioxide can move or diffuse between them. So when you breathe in, and air comes down through the trachea and through bronchi into the alveoli. So this fresh air has lots of oxygen in it, and some of this oxygen will travel across the wall of the alveoli into your bloodstream. So it covers, and traveling in the opposite direction is a carbon dioxide, which crosses from the blood into the capillaries, into the air in the alveoli, and then it is breathed out. So in this way, you bring into your body the oxygen, and you need to get rid to the waste product of carbon dioxide. So we have here the diaphragm, which how lungs work. Yan. Breathing. So the lungs are sealed in pleural membranes inside the chest cavity, and at the bottom of the cavity it is a large flat muscle known as the diaphragm. So during inhalation, the diaphragm contracts and the rib cage rises up. So this expands the volume of the chest cavity. So the chest cavity is sealed. So this creates a partial vacuum inside the cavity, and the atmospheric pressures fills the lungs as air rushes into the air passages. So breathing also, often exhaling, is a passive event. So when the rib cage lower and the diaphragm relaxes, the pressure in the chest cavity is greater than the atmospheric pressure. So when breathing is air is pushed out of our lungs.